Coming up, as the Brooklyn Nets offseason unfolded, in addition to the return of stalwart Nic Claxton and the development of Day'ron Sharpe, Trenton Watford was folded into the mix. Does this answer all of the questions the Brooklyn Nets have at center? We break down the stats, angles, and potential lineups for Brooklyn next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast, right on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie. He's the owner-operator of DFSR for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Arbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast and your New Jersey Devils on the Devils Puck Luck podcast. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And tell you today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/Locked On today to get started. And Doug, where we get started is with the everlasting question, the well that you can always go back to with Brooklyn. Have they solved the center position behind Nic Claxton? This looks like they're going to try something different, but maybe the same going into this year.
Yeah, look, man, it's been the area of much consternation among the fan base over the last couple of years is where the Nets, are they ever going to have like all these real center minutes? Does Sean Marks only want to just sign wings that can eventually play center? Does Sean Marks just not want to play centers outside of Nic Claxton? I mean, this is obviously
Sean Marks not know that the center is a position in the basketball. Like maybe he doesn't know.
He might know and not care. Like it doesn't, and maybe that's correct. I'm not sure. There's some stats that would say it's not. There's other stats that probably could tell you that there's parts of it that are correct. But suffice to say that over the last few years, the Nets have not had much in the way of traditional center minutes. And it does not look like they're going to go into this season with, outside of Nic Claxton, probably. I mean, we'll talk about Day'ron Sharpe too, with a ton of traditional center minutes as well. Trenton Watford and these guys like Bazely, and maybe they go super small ball, but it's clearly has been a need, at least in terms of size. And I'm not sure that this offseason did a ton to solve it, even though there might be a little bit more light at the end of the tunnel, especially when it came to the draft as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The years passed, and again, the superstar era of basketball, we were cycling through a lot of different guys like LaMarcus Aldridge and, and other veterans who didn't have a lot of tread on the tires and trying to fit, I would think, square pegs into round holes in a lot of ways. This year, and what we're going to talk about today is like all of these young players that potentially could fill roles. And even if it's not going to be in the way that a lot of Nets fans want them to, I think it, at least for me, offers like more functionality, more optimism, and more potential for guys to actually carve out significant roles. I know you have some stats that we want to point to just when it comes to the guys that were here, and that's Nic Claxton, and that's Day'ron Sharpe, and the guys that are no longer with us. As a reminder, Claxton is going into what will become a contract year for him. And last season, effectively, even though we've known now for years that we believe in the development of him, and it's been 2 seasons of him looking like the answer as a starting center for the Brooklyn Nets, last year is the first time where he played 76 games, started all 76, played basically 30 minutes a night, and gave you some of the dominant true shooting percentages, the numbers around the basket, and all of the defensive value that we believed he could get. So it is interesting, like, as we start this discussion, remember, like, we're only in year 2 of the fully cemented Nic Claxton reality, which feels odd to say because it has been years of watching him slowly build to this point and never always playing big minutes or consistently, right?
Yeah, well, I said this last year, was that Nic Claxton was in year 4, but he was really like in year 2.5. If you look at his overall minutes, because so much had gotten in the way. And I think that, just starting with him at center, there's no doubt Nic Claxton is a true blue NBA starting center. Like that is not really up for debate. The guy was amazing last year. Defensively, was among the very best centers in the game, especially if you're going to play a switching scheme. He's one of the very best guys you can have. So I don't think like that part of the equation is really up for that much debate. I actually think that the part around Claxton, and I'm happy to have just gotten some of this stuff right when we were like, you know, when they wanted to play DeAndre Jordan, they were like, oh no, it's going to be Jared Allen. Then like, okay, well, Allen's gone. It's like, hey, Claxton is the guy. We went through this last year. And I think we were early on that Claxton kind of solved a lot of what they were going to do, even for some deficiencies. So I think that this conversation is a little outside of Nic Claxton, and it's really kind of about the rest of the minutes. Because when you look at, you know, if you're going to play like traditional sort of like center minutes, right, you really have really north of like 3,900 total minutes to play over the course of a season, right? It's 48 minutes times 82. So that takes you to, you know, getting close to 4,000 minutes for like a center to play on your court. Now, Claxton played 2,100 of those minutes last year. And so you're like, okay, that's a lot, right? Or excuse me, 2,200. Played 2,200 last year. And then Day'ron Sharpe played around 550 minutes. Well, that still leaves more than 1,000 minutes of time on the court for like size to not kind of be there. And I think for the Nets fans, I suspect, and probably for us too, it's those 1,000 minutes that we have the biggest problem with, right? It's like what was happening in those minutes during the course of the season. And that might even be outside what you think of Day'ron Sharpe, but it's like it was those times more than anything that it became really glaring that the Nets lacked overall size, right? And I think that that's the, because I mean, we're not really discussing whether Nic Claxton is a center option, right? We both agree. Okay, right, yeah.
This is what we're establishing, is that Nicholas Claxton is the starting center for the Brooklyn Nets, and we don't think that that's something that's being debated, but that he's not a part of the problem. And I think just to clarify, when we've talked about in years past about DeAndre Jordan, as you brought up, and no, it should be Nicholas Claxton, a lot of the pushback was his size, he's too thin, right? He doesn't have the bulk, all of those things you pointed to. And really what we got was the proof in the sample size this past year. And Nicholas Claxton got a little bit more muscular, but it doesn't matter because he's so fundamentally sound and he plays such a high level of basketball IQ on the defensive end that we saw him take on bigger matchups and still be just as effective, still avoid fouls. And we saw that happen over the course of the volume. So just to, as we start to turn our attention to these other options, let's just mention on Day'ron Sharpe here, because when you talk about those minutes breakdowns, played a little over 500 minutes last year. Now, if he plays 10 minutes a night for an 82-game season, and not everyone's going to play every single game, but hey, I can do the quick math there. That's 800 minutes, right? So you could potentially see an increase on him. And I think as we open up this discussion, I just want to point out that Day'ron Sharpe is 21 years old, is still developing. And I think in the same way of Nicholas Claxton, like he's been around for long enough that we've maybe warped our expectations around what his development should look like. And I only bring it up to say that for whatever he is or is not, we have seen a couple of marginal moves forward for him statistically. And then with these new additions of a Trenton Watford, even of a Darius Bazely, of having still Dorian Finney-Smith here, how can you find the right value for a role for Day'ron Sharpe? We'll start to explore that more, as well as the other young players coming up here next.
All right, before we get to all that, I'll tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. Football season's about to kick off. FanDuel is giving you the chance to win all season long right now. Listen to this. When you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets every time that Super Bowl winner that you picked wins in the regular season. You heard me right here. You pick any team to win the Super Bowl in FanDuel, and you get bonus bets for every one of those teams' victory. You can use those bonus bets on spreads, player props, over-unders. FanDuel's got a bunch of stuff up there right now as we head into the season. Maybe you're like Adam over there, and you're a true blue Giant believer. Saquon Barkley plus 1,400 to lead the league in rushing yards. Okay, maybe you should try to get in on that. They got props for everything you can imagine heading into NFL season. You got to go check our friends out over at FanDuel. You go to FanDuel.com/locked-on. Start earning those bonus bets with America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel.com/locked-on.
Okay. So as we turn our attention talking about the center position, and more specifically, the backup center position, and fundamentally what the Brooklyn Nets plan to do with their approach. I was just mentioning Day'ron Sharpe there before we turn our attention to Trenton Watford, who I do find to be particularly intriguing here for the Brooklyn Nets. I will just say, there's two things that I noticed about Day'ron Sharpe when I was pulling up his numbers. One, the dude is absolutely lights out from beyond the arc. Now,
55% from three.
He only took 11. He only took 11 of those. I don't care. The math adds up. And I tongue in cheek, but remember when he was drafted, we looked at it and said, is there a chance that that area of his game could develop? Yes. We talked to some people from Locked On ACC who covered, and they said, don't dream on it in the short term, but eventually you could potentially see him crossing that threshold. And I bring it up because, again, he's 21 years old, and that could still grow. But by and large, what you're looking at with Day'Ron Sharpe is a sagging big that's going to sit in the paint. He's going to defend well when he's anchored in front of the basket. He's going to be absolutely elite in terms of block percentages, and the offensive rebounding is going to be there for you as well. If he can unlock any level of just minor threat from beyond the arc, then as we get to the back end of this episode, we can talk about how you carve out a role for this guy. But right now, he represents to me maybe the least, and take this with what it's intended by NBA standards, the least athletic player that the Brooklyn Nets have on their roster, the least versatile player that they have on their roster. And just by the footprint of what Sean Marks has done over the course of this offseason, I think you need to be more of that. You need to be athletic. You need to be fast. You need to be switchable. And Day'Ron Sharpe is going to be the guy that has the longest road in order to get to a place where he can show that kind of value.
Yeah, Sharpe's numbers from last year are just hilarious when you look at him over the course of the whole season. He was 6th overall on the whole team in rebounds. Now, you're going to say, okay, well, they switched the team halfway through. That's fine. And I can hear that, except that when you go to the actual minutes played, he was 16th on the team in minutes. So when you get all those guys factored in, all the other guys that even came in played way more minutes than him, but the rebounding is just, it has been 1-to-1. He's been a great rebounder. And, you know, you mentioned about the threes, the 55%. Yeah, is it luck in the short term? Kind of. I mean, a lot of guys, if given 11 shots, are not going to hit 6 of them, like in an NBA game. So I do think there's like at least a reason to say, hey, take a few more of these and let's just find out what the number is. At least it started off well, right? So I think for Sharpe, I would like to see more minutes from him, just because I think there's like enough of a backbone in terms of just what his overall skills are. And I think it's just one of those things. It's sort of like the Cam Thomas thing. It's a little different, but it's like, let's just see it. These are the years to find out. Like, let's just get him out there for more than 500 minutes so we can just know for sure. And that's kind of how I feel about him going into this year too. Like, I think you want to live with some of the warts to know if you have something with him. And this is the year to find out. So I'm all for that increased number from the center. I'm not sure it's going to happen, but I'd be fine with it happening, especially as we wait in some of these other guys.
And just to your point, man, he only made 2 out of the 7 3-point attempts he took in 21-22. So that was bad percentage. Good percentage last year. Here's, as we start to talk about now, Trenton Watford, who the Brooklyn Nets also brought in. And finally, man, you know, when you're living, throwing out names left, right, and center over the course of an offseason that you want to see the Nets potentially draft or go sign or pursue, and none of them come to fruition, I actually stopped thinking about Trenton Watford. And then that's, of course, when the Nets bring him into the fold. Here's where I think we start this conversation that I find interesting. So you mentioned just on Day'Ron Sharpe, again, he's absolutely elite in an offensive rebounding rate from a percentile. He's in the 100th percentile of offensive rebounding, 80th percentile in defensive rebounding. Rim defense is 81st percentile, and block percentage is 94th. Okay. But here's what I found interesting about him, and this folds into the versatility, especially defensively. Day'Ron Sharpe is 6'9", 265. He's the thickest guy they got. But he also only has a 7-foot wingspan. And combined with the lack of maybe defensive versatility that you want from him, and Watford doesn't have great numbers supporting his defensive value, but Watford at 6'7.5" has the second longest wingspan now behind Nic Claxton at 7'2.5". Like, that matters when you're talking about a roster that doesn't have height but has size. And we already talked about this with the starting rotation. Now I think a player like Trenton Watford, who comes in at 240 pounds, represents a little bit more bulk, some athleticism. We'll talk about the offensive side of the floor and what he brings there. But this is where, like, if you're comparing these other guys that we're talking about for some backup minutes, these are the measurables that could say, hey, this is where you maybe get over a little bit on Day'Ron in terms of your overall value, even if you're not the same rebounding force that Day'Ron is.
And even his rebounding per minute would have been better. Yeah. It would have been better than a lot of other Nets guys last season too. Like his rebounding per minute, I think would have been 5th on the team. I mean, he was with Portland, but it was because like the Nets didn't have any, by the way, of the guys who were left over. Like I didn't count KD and Kyrie and guys like Kyrie is actually a decent rebounder for the position, but like I didn't count any of those guys because they're not with the team anymore. Among the guys who were left, like Watford's rebounding rate still would have ranked pretty high on the Nets. And that's where you kind of start getting excited to see what he can do, even on a non-guaranteed deal. Cause it's like, hey, are you going to be able to come up with some of the things that the Nets just have struggled to do. And I actually think, and I'm glad you brought up the length, because I do think overall that's where Marks has probably tried to go, right? With these signings is like, hey, we are not going to go just traditional center that some people want to see come in here, right? Like the names, and I'm not going to go through all the names. We've heard all the names before of who Nets want to go grow roots in the lane and never move, and like just these just old, and the older the better as far as some people were concerned. Like when it came to centers, it was like, hey, they're ancient, like, oh, that's even better. They were good like in the early 2000s. Awesome, bring them in. No, but I think what he's tried to do, for better for worse, it's maybe the jury's out, maybe it's not, maybe this is just not the right idea, is he's tried to say, okay, we're not going to go for those guys, but we're going to try to make it up with guys who are as long as possible, who can do everything else. Because you can put right now Nets lineups together with Watford, helps with this, of just like all dudes 7 foot or more wingspans.
Yep.
And it wouldn't be like the worst lineup in the world. It probably wouldn't be great, but like Simmons, Bridges, Watford, Bazely, Claxton. I mean, that's like you would never score, but like they have all these dudes who have these massive wingspans. So I think they're trying to make it up along those margins rather than bringing in just, your Jack Londales of the world or something like that, like these other free agents that were out there that maybe could have been had.
And by the way, and I agree with you too, right? And I think, again, we said this coming into the offseason, youth and upside is where the Brooklyn Nets should be trying to go here, not going for aging veterans that, maybe in the short term functionally have a little bit more of a consistent role or know how to serve a certain purpose for your team, but it means nothing to you in the aggregate of like what you're trying to accomplish and what you'll look like a year from now when that old guy is gone and you don't have any more clarity around the position. The interesting thing I'll say about, positives from Watford is obviously he'll get out and run in transition. He also is good from beyond the arc. And I pulled these numbers the other day, actually. His above the break is good as well. So you can use him in kind of this interesting role offensively that we haven't seen the Nets have even in Claxton or in Day'Ron or other guys that they cycled through here. If we want to just make sure that we nail down on what one of the concerns would be and a shared similarity with a Day'Ron Sharpe, both of these players, when you go and look at some of their statistical categories, the biggest concern here would be, and by the way, a feather in Day'Ron's cap, he did improve marginally his free throw shooting year over year as well, up into the low mid 60s now. Watford is 72% from the line, but they both of them averaged almost 2 personal fouls per game last season. Day'Ron playing an average of 11.5 minutes, Trendon playing an average of 19 minutes. Your concern here is there viability on the defensive end to stay on the floor, right? For all the rebounding value of Day'Ron, he's the kind of guy that at times will just seem to be out of place. Some of that can come on switching and getting over screens, right? And that communication on the defensive end. Coming up here next, though, we'll not only touch on, obviously, the young rookie Noah Clowney and his development, but I will provide for Doug what I think is the lineup scenario that Sean Marks has built with the addition of Trenton Watford, Day'ron Sharpe, and even Dorian Finney-Smith, and yes, Darius Bazely. We'll get into it next. The other thing that I went and did was like compare Darius Bazely and Trenton Watford. And by the way, Bazely also comes in at almost 6'8" and with a 7-foot wingspan. He has some of the shot from beyond the arc as well. When you compare those three players, Bazely, Sharpe, and Watford, like it's actually surprising when you think about Bazley's only 22 years old, but he's played over 5,000 minutes in the league. Like it is a stark contrast. 5,300, 2,000 for Trenton Watford, 943 NBA minutes for Day'Ron Sharpe. So even though they're all in the same age group, there's a difference in terms of NBA level experience. I actually think the scenario that the Nets could end up trying to execute in small sample sizes potentially is thinking about Day'Ron Sharpe as the more stationary big sitting in the lane. Because one of the other comps I'll just remind everybody of here, I know I'm going long-winded, but I got buried in the stats. What Day'Ron Sharpe is not good at is rim frequency. So on drives to the basket, the ability for a player to stay with the offensive player and affect the shot at the rim. For Trenton Watford, 92nd percentile in that category. For a guy like Darius Bazely, he is also going to be 89th percentile, 88th percentile in versatility, 95th percentile in block percentage. I think the Nets are going to try to operate with small ball lineups. When Day'Ron's on the floor, it's going to be sinking back. And the other combinations need to be able to be switchable out in front of him. So you don't ask him to get pulled away from the basket so he can maximize his value. Then you look at the Dorian Finney-Smith small ball lineup. I think that's the other thing that the Nets are going to do here. And then you try to use a Darius Bazely off of that. And you think about this is how we do it short term. And the long term is Darius Bazely develops into your replacement from Dorian Finney-Smith, and Trenton Watford represents a supplemental option when you look at the 4 or 5 position going forward potentially. Whether or not either of them work out, this is what I think that the Nets want to try to give sample size to going into the season.
Yeah, like I agree with you. I think because I think the couple of things are true. I think that based on the other stuff that's happened, I'm not sure they have tons and tons of trust in Day'ron Sharpe. Like, I mean, we'll know that kind of quickly, but some of the other signings don't make me feel like he's going to pair really well with these guys anyway. So I just don't know if he's part of their long-term plan. You mentioned Noah Clowney. I think I agree with you. That is years away. And so at least a year. I'm not sure how much we see of him this year. It looked not great in summer league, and there's not a lot. I don't know if there's a lot to build off of there early, right? I'm not crossing him off here, but I just don't think we're going to see him after that. Yeah, no, I think what we're going to see is like what you said is this attempt to make it up along these lengthy margins and then hope that that's just good enough, with the understanding that when the Joel Embiids and when the Nikola Jokic's, or maybe like Anthony Davis, like some of these bigger, I know he's not a traditional 5, but he's awesome. So whatever, we'll throw him in there. Like these other guys come to town, that it's going to be, hopefully Claxton can hold up. Otherwise it's going to be problematic. I think that that's just what we're going to see another season of having to live with, because I just don't think that these other guys were brought in to not take upside flyers on.
Yeah. Right.
This isn't like LaMarcus Aldridge or Blake Griffin or whatever, where you just kind of bring them in there, roll their old bag of bones out into the court and hope it just sort of works out for 10 to 15 minute stretches. I think they're going to want to see these younger guys for longer stretches too, to know if they have like any long-term value or trade value or something, like try to catch lightning in a bottle. And I think that's going to be the other reason, to agree with you, that we're going to see lots of these guys in combinations, because the Nets just sort of owe it to themselves to try to hit some upside on some of these younger guys. They have to. They don't have the draft picks. They have to try to find something in some of these dudes. And without the draft picks, and maybe Day'Ron fits into this thing too, and he should play also, but they're just going to have to see these guys in a lot of combinations. Otherwise, legit, what was the point? They need to hit on some of these younger dudes in order to have sort of any long-term chance at sort of rebuilding the team.
And it's a good point to bring up as well when we talk about the veterans brought in during the championship runs. Well, those were 1-year flyers, half-year flyers, fine.
Yeah.
These represent flyers as well, but you can identify something here and say, okay. And this, by the way, it extends to Lonnie Walker, I think, as well, when you talk about other guys that were brought in for the backcourt purposes. And when you think about the draft class included. So you're talking about 8 bodies, right? Over the next year plus, you want to shake out 2 or 3 really solid ones that you think can be contributors for you. And this ain't nothing, by the way, just to make sure, like Jalen Wilson, I think at some point this season will also play a factor in the front court at 6'8", et cetera. So you're going to have these opportunities to look at Day'Ron Sharpe and say, okay, by the way, I think his biggest hindrance, I know I'm getting circular, his biggest hindrance is he doesn't function particularly well on the offensive end. And I don't mean that he doesn't have a shot even. I mean that he's not great in pick and roll scenarios as well, because he just seems to be that step slow and a step late. And all this is predicated on athleticism and movement. And that's where I think, I don't know, man, when we did the minutes breakdowns, and go ahead.
To defend them here on that, it's like, and that's also don't have great pick and roll ball handlers either, right? So he's way behind the. I agree with you that he has not shown enough even in the opportunities, and it's not like the Nets have had these high functioning pick and roll guys that can unlock, like Harden. It's like, hey, if you had hands and could move to the basket, Harden was going to get you 8 to 10 points a game, right? Just because he was so good at it. He was so good at pick and roll. He was so good at getting to the rim and knowing and the timing to be just right. The Nets don't have anyone even close to these guys. So a guy like him needs a guy like that, right? And so, and it's just always going to be hard for him. Dinwiddie, I don't think, is that guy as much as they tried to do it before. So just to defend Day'Ron a little bit in that, I agree with you, but he also needs this guy. But the Nets haven't brought in these kind of guys, so I just don't see it kind of shifting either.
And maybe in the sample size that we start to see, maybe Dennis Smith Jr. does represent that for Day'Ron if they end up getting paired together, where it is, hey, I'm looking to get you that ball, right? I'm looking to find you in spots potentially. if we then take the, like, so pull back here, the one thing that we didn't mention, and I think somewhat intentionally over the course of this episode, we said it in kind of combinations we could see, but Ben Simmons is the other big factor here, right? Like, we understand that if he's playing and he's healthy, and the hierarchy and how the minutes break down, it can make some of these guys a little less impactful. But I did just want to ask, when you look at this group of players, who do you, is there a guy? For me, you know that I could see any young player get going for themselves and find minutes. But when we did the minutes breakdown, I saw that there's 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how you feel about Lonnie Walker and about Cam Thomas and Day'Ron Sharpe. We got 20 to 25 minutes that these young guys, Trenton Watford, Darius Bazely, they're going to get their runs here. And I'll be interested to see how it unfolds. I think Trenton Watford maybe is the more exciting of the two for how he'll function and his size, at least in the short term. So I'll be fascinated if his non-guaranteed contract actually translates and gets into the regular season.
Yeah, I think probably like to see a little more Bazely, just because I think that guy could like sort of pop on another team too. And I think that like there's a world where they could rehab that, and you take your lumps with that. I mean, what's clear that the Nets have to solve, and I'm hoping they can at least solve some of this, and we'll get out of here on this, is that no doubt about it, the rebounding and the size was and has been a problem for the team. They're among the worst in opponent offensive rebounding rates, in that they let up a ton of them, right? We saw all these second possessions and second chance points from other teams because it was like lack of size and maybe lack of hustle, or lack of guys with nose to get on the boards. Like I think that's a skill too. I think there's undersized guys that are great rebounders, just because they have a nose for the ball. That's also don't have those guys, right? Like, and so I think we could, no matter how these combinations play out, I think while I'm excited to see them and I'm excited to have some of these guys hopefully maybe take a step forward in terms of overall NBA value, I do think we're probably in for another season where the rebounding and this stuff is probably still a problem, right? Like I think that.
So then, very quickly, then, have the Nets improved it? Have they improved what their rebounding scenario is going to look like this year? Because I think that's what fans care the most about. Is like, did it get any better? Even if you don't think they solved it the right way or the way you wanted. Yeah.
I think they improved it, and not to the level that's going to really appease the fan base is my answer. I think it's like, they almost can't help but be better just because they have gotten basically bigger across the board here. Like, get rid of Seth Curry, get rid of Patty Mills, get rid of Joe Harris, and bring in a lot of other, like some other bigger dudes. Like they just have to bring back Ben Simmons. Like, that'll help. I think they will be better. They almost can't be worse to some degree. But I don't know if it's going to be to the level of like getting them to the average. I don't know if that's coming. And I think that's probably maybe the break-even line of where you start feeling good about it. I do not think they'll be an above average rebounding team on the season. So I think
they were something like 28th or so in the league last year. So by the way, though, if all these moves and the collection of players, if it gets you to 24th, that's an improvement. Like, it's moving in the right direction, right?
It's going to move.
It matters for this team.
It'll move, but it'll still be below average. And it'll still, so room for frustration. All right, we're going to get out of here. Make sure you subscribe over. Yeah. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube, Locked On Nets YouTube, climbing towards 6,000. We'll be there pretty soon. So be part of that group that gets in on that. And make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Both of those things are free. Number one way is to help the podcast.
Every summer, around late July and into August, I find myself in Europe performing at any festival that will have me. Yeah. That's Henry Rollins.
There's a lot of Henry Rollins chatter on this the podcast. One of the all-time great poets. Guys talked a lot about August, I guess. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball.